I'm going to be talking today about the book of Genesis from the Jerusalem Bible. Part of my project to read through the Bible. For more information about why I'm doing this, see the started video in the link down below. I've labeled this as a book review because it fits in kind of with my book review project, but obviously I'm not going to be reviewing the Bible. I'm not going to be saying like 3.5 out of 5 stars or anything like that, but I am trying to approach this as literature. So I'm going to be talking about the experience of reading it. What parts were difficult to read, what parts were pleasant to read, how it feels as a reader. So maybe the first thing to note is the length of it. So this took me about 2.5 weeks, but that was me approaching this at a leisurely pace, balancing this with several other reading projects and being really busy with work and family and stuff like that. I think I perhaps could have read this in a couple of afternoons if I had been really dedicated to it. It's 59 pages here in my edition. Now, that, of course, is with the small print. The Bible, of course, is famous for its small print in most editions. There are sections of this where the narrative is smooth and easygoing, and those sections read easily. There were sections of this where the narrative didn't appear to make a lot of sense, and where I was constantly going back to see if I'd missed something or trying to make sense of stuff, checking Wikipedia or other Bible commentaries online. And obviously that slows down the pace, and I think that has to be accounted for. But I think you could probably read this in 2 or 3 afternoons if you were really dedicated to it. Right, okay. So one more bit of throat clearing before we get into this. There is just so much stuff to talk about with the book of Genesis. I mean, even just the first 3 chapters alone, the creation account and the fall, I could be here talking for hours about all the different things in the text, all the theological implications and everything like that, the different interpretations. And there are just so many bizarre little stories in this short book that I'm going to do my best to get through as much material as I can while this camera is running. But I don't know how long I'm going to talk for, 30, 40 minutes or something. But however long it is, inevitably, there's going to be a lot of material I don't get around to covering, but I'll do my best to make a go at talking through the stuff in Genesis. So let's start at the beginning. The book of Genesis means in the beginning. It's not a Hebrew word. I think it's a Greek word, and that goes to show how much influence Greek has had on our culture. I guess that must come from the Septuagint translation, the famous Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was, I believe, commonly read in the classical Greek and Roman world, more commonly read than the original text itself, and so that has a influence on the cultural legacy of it. And in fact, there's an interesting little footnote, actually, speaking of which, talks about Jacob's family moving into Egypt, and the number totals something like, the number totals 75. Sorry, the number totals 70. But then there's a footnote here. I know you can't see that, but take my word for it. That in the book of Acts, when Stephen is talking about the same event, Stephen says it was 75 people. And the footnote says that's because the writer of Acts was going off the Septuagint translation, the Greek translation. Sorry, all of that is just a tangent. Getting back to this. Traditionally, the book of Genesis was ascribed to Moses as the author, as were the first 5 books of the Bible. Modern scholarship has disagreed with that for a number of reasons. First of all, people have been noticing ever since the Middle Ages that the language in here does not seem to make sense with the type of language Moses would have used. Things like the verb tenses, things like the pronouns and reference words like here or there would have seemed to be different than Moses's reference. The way Moses described himself in this book does not seem like the way these books characterize Moses does not seem to be like the way Moses would have written about himself, etc. If you're interested in more information about this, you can read The Age of Reason by Thomas Paine. That's Thomas Paine, the famous founding father of America. He wrote a book called The Age of Reason, in which a lot of the book was just arguing all the reasons why Moses couldn't possibly have been the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. So following on from that, German scholars in the 19th century identified what they thought were 4 sources for the book of Genesis and the historical part, the whole historical part of the Bible. 2 older sources and 2 not quite as old sources. So the 2 older sources are the J source and the E source. The E source stands for Elohim, and the J source stands for Yahweh. Now in English we would say Yahweh with a Y, but these are German scholars, so they said Yahweh with a J. Jehovah is the same thing as Yahweh, so you can see where those 2 things come from. I guess Jehovah must have been... Jehovah is English, but older English, I don't know. One of the things that you could tell if you're reading the Bible in the original Hebrew is that it goes back and forth between Elohim and Yahweh as the names of God, of the supreme being. This is usually preserved in English translation one way or the other. I think the way it's done in the NIV, and I think maybe the King James version of the Bible, is Elohim is translated as God, Yahweh is translated as Lord. I'm reading the Jerusalem Bible here, so they translate Elohim as God, and they just translate Yahweh as Yahweh. I think one of the reasons that Yahweh is often translated as Lord is because there's a tradition that comes from the Jewish tradition that you're not actually supposed to say the name Yahweh out loud. But I think modern translations of the Bible it's not a thing modern Christians are concerned about, although I think it is still a thing that Orthodox Jews are concerned about. So yeah, there's the Yahweh source, the J source, and the E source. And they're being edited together with 2 later sources, the P source, which is the priestly source, which has all the rules of priestly purity, and the D source, which is the Deuteronomistic historian, which is a historian who's editing this all together. He gets named after Deuteronomy because his worldview is very much the worldview that gets set out at the end of Deuteronomy, where if you follow God's commandments, Israel will prosper. If you stray and you worship other gods, then Israel will be attacked by her enemies. And the polemic of the historical books of the Old Testament, not Genesis, but the later books, is very much following this. So I think those commandments were set out in Deuteronomy, and then the rest of the historical narrative follows that polemic. So it's named the D source after the Deuteronomistic historian. For more information on this, Christine Hayes' lectures on the Old Testament is very, excuse me, my throat's a bit dry. I'm going to try and soldier through. Christine Hayes' lectures on the Old Testament are interesting to check out. You can check them out on YouTube. Yale Open Courses, Christine Hayes Introduction to the Hebrew Bible or Introduction to the Old Testament. She does a very good job of explaining the history behind the JEPD theory, how scholars came by it, what are the strengths and weaknesses of the theory in terms of its explanatory value. Also, another book I've talked about on this channel, the unauthorized version, Truth and Fiction in the Bible by Robin Lane Fox. He does not do so much of a good job of explaining where this theory comes from, but he examines the characteristics of the individual sources more in detail. So he says, the J source is more interested in a more anthropomorphic God, the God who walks in the Garden of Eden, the God who shuts the door to Noah's Ark. And the J source is also interested in what he calls the just so stories, that is why this town is named this way. That is why these people have this name. Those origin stories, I guess, appear more in the J source. I'm reading this out of the Jerusalem Bible, which is not the version of the Bible I grew up with, but it's a version that was available to me here in Vietnam when I was looking for a translation to order online. The NIV version, which I grew up with, was not available online. One of the interesting things about reading this translation, I was surprised because the Jerusalem Bible, I think, is one of the approved translations of the Catholic Church. And it carries on the back. On the back, it seems to boast about how this version is for conservative Catholics and Protestant Christians, because it includes a traditional non-inclusive language. And yet, the footnotes and the introduction given to this take into account much more modern scholarship than I would have had expected from a version of the Bible that is touting itself as conservative. So it says right here in their introduction that the first 5 books of the Bible are traditionally ascribed to Moses. Quoting directly here. However, modern study of the text has revealed a variety of styles, a lack of sequence, and such repetitions and variations in narrative that it is impossible to ascribe the whole group to a single author. 4 distinct literary traditions can be identified and found side by side in the Pentateuch. 2 of these go back to the time when Israel became a nation, a period dominated by the figure Moses, blah, 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 blah. It essentially talks about the 4-source theory. And then the footnotes throughout will occasionally... The version I have here is the reader's version. I believe the original version of the Jerusalem Bible included much more extensive footnotes. But there are some footnotes in here, and the footnotes, somewhat to my surprise, will point out the various contradictions and say, okay, notice here, there are 2 different versions of the same story, which have been put together by a later editor. You can see the contradictions here. Will occasionally be put in the footnotes. Or they will also say things like, okay, this is some sort of folk etymology for why this place was named this thing or why these people had this name, but it's not a very convincing etymology. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, how strange to actually find that in the footnotes of the Bible. I mean, I know, like Christopher Hitchens or something loves to write about this stuff, but I didn't expect to find this in the footnotes of this edition. So that was just a little interesting thing about this new edition I'm reading. New meaning new to me. I have been looking ahead, going to some of the New Testament to see if the footnotes are going to be as critical. And just by glancing and skimming ahead, it looks like the commentary and the footnotes in the New Testament is much more conservative. They do not take a historical critical view of some of the problematic passages in the New Testament. But interesting that these will be in the Old Testament. So, yes, one of the features of the first 5 books of the Bible, especially Genesis, is because there are different narratives being compiled, there will often be repetition. Now, another interesting thing to check out is Grant Voth, V-O-T-H, the Great Courses series, the History of World Literature, which you can get from the Great Courses series. He, in his comment, he includes the Old Testament in his History of World Literature because it's part of the Western canon. I mean, it's a religious text, but it's also part of the Western literary tradition. And he talks about the different versions of the same story appearing, and he says this is interesting. The editors of the Bible, whoever they were, I guess it's often thought that the D source was the final editor, obviously knew that they were including 2 different versions of the same story. So, it's not like this is a mistake, like somebody made a mistake in the Bible. They had these traditions. They thought, okay, this story is really important and we have to preserve it. And this story is really important and we have to preserve it. And so they just put the 2 different stories side by side. And he says it's an interesting example of how you can, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. You choose which version of the story you want to go with, I believe is how he describes it. And he gives as an example, right from the beginning, the 2 different creation stories we have in Genesis 1 and 2. Now, I was in my early 30s when I was first listening to his lectures on the Great Courses series. And that was the first time in my life I realized there were 2 separate creation stories in the book of Genesis. I'd be interested in other people's experience of this, particularly people who grew up in the church. And it was one of those, duh type moments, because I knew both of these stories. I had heard both of these stories in Sunday school. And I had never put it together that these were 2 separate stories, even though they were obviously 2 separate stories, because the first story is God created the world in 6 days and then he rested on the 7th day. And so in this story, God creates the animals first, and then he creates man and female together. And I knew that story. In the second version, God creates the Garden of Eden. He creates Adam, who he puts in the Garden of Eden, and then God feels bad that Adam is all there alone without anyone to interact with. So God says, okay, let's create the animals so that Adam has somebody to interact with, so he won't be so lonely. So God creates all the animals, and they all come to Adam to get their names after God's created them. And then it says, no suitable helpmate was found. It's actually not clear in the Bible, or not clear in my reading, whether that means God decided no suitable helpmate was found, or whether Adam said, hey, God, none of these animals are doing it for me. It's not clear who made that decision, but for somehow or other, no suitable helpmate was found, so God created the woman. So two different views of creation. And for all the time I had spent growing up debating whether Genesis was supposed to be literal or metaphoric, or theistic evolution versus a literal 7-day creation, nobody had pointed out to me that there were 2 versions in this story. And again, the names are different. So for example, in Genesis 1, the 6-day creation, they're using the Elohim God, although apparently that does not come from the E source. It comes from the priestly source. I guess the reason it comes from the priestly source is because the emphasis on resting on the 7th day is why scholars think it comes from the priestly source. The second one comes from the J source. So, although in my translation they have it translated as Yahweh God, which is only for Genesis 2. And then it switches to Yahweh in the other ones. So I don't know what Yahweh God signifies. Some sort of... I think in the NIV and other English translations they'll translate it as Lord for Genesis 2. But the name for God changes in two different accounts of creation. Now, this repetition of stories is all the way through. So, for example, there are 3 different stories when one of the patriarchs is going with his wife into a new land, and they're worried that because his wife is so beautiful, the king of that land is going to take his wife for himself and kill the patriarch. So the patriarch says to his wife, okay, pretend you're my sister. And then the king takes her as his wife. And then the king finds out, oh no, this is actually the wife of Abraham, and now I'm going to be punished by God. Or the wife of Isaac in one case. That story happens 3 times. 2 different times it happens with Abraham and Sarah. And then one time it happens with Isaac and Rebekah. Slightly different each time, but essentially the same story. So that's obviously an example of repetition. There are other times when the 2 different versions appear to be mashed together in a way that doesn't quite make it coherent or makes it a little bit difficult to actually follow what's going on. One example of this is the flood. And again, if you go to Christine Hayes' lectures on the Old Testament, she does a good job of talking through the different contradictions just within Genesis 6 and 7, and why this is indicating that 2 different sources are being smashed together. Another example is Joseph being sold into slavery, where there are 2 different versions being smashed together here. And in this case, the Jerusalem Bible, the footnotes here, helped bring this to my attention. In one version, Reuben is the older brother that takes pity on Joseph and wants to save him from his brothers. In the other version, it's Judah. And because these versions are mashed side by side with each other, you have Reuben saying to his brothers, okay, don't kill him, but we don't want to kill Joseph. We want to bully him, but we don't want to kill him. And then Reuben goes away, and then Judah says the exact same thing. Like, hold on, we don't want to kill Joseph. Let's sell him into slavery, but we don't want to kill him. And you're thinking, well, hang on, it was just established in the previous paragraph that they had already agreed not to kill him. Why are we going through this again? And then it goes back and forth whether Joseph was sold to the Midianites or the Ishmaelites, and whether the Midianites found him in the well or whether the brothers took him out of the well to sell into slavery. So it's interesting to see that there are 2 versions going side by side here together. It also makes it a little bit disorienting to read when you're approaching this as literature. And that's not even counting the references to things which are not even in the text. So, for example, where is it? The end of Genesis 48. Israel being the other name for Jacob, said to Joseph, now I am about to die, but God will be with you and take you back to the country of your fathers. As for me, I will give you a shekel more than your brothers. The footnote here explains that Shechem is a pun that's being used. It's referring to the land. It's also referring to the shoulder, which is usually given to the guests at a feast. The one I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. So he's saying to Joseph, I'm going to give you more land. I'm going to give you the land that I took from the Amorites with my sword and bow. So I'm reading this and I'm thinking, when did Jacob take land from the Amorites with the sword and bow? And I'm thinking, did I miss something? Did I forget something? Because there's a lot of callbacks here, and a lot of times it is because I forgot something, or it is because I missed something. But I'm going back. Where were the Amorites? So I'm looking this up, and BibleHub.com is a great help for this because they include a number of different biblical commentaries, which range from conservative commentaries, conservative religious commentaries, to more secular commentaries. And those commentaries say, yeah, scholars don't know what this means. There's no story about Jacob taking the land from the Amorites with his sword and bow. And so some people think this is, the more conservative religious commentaries say this is maybe a prophecy of what the tribe of Israel is going to do during the conquest of Canaan. It's weird to take that interpretation because the verb tenses are all wrong, unless there's something about Hebrew verb tenses I don't know, but certainly in English. Or that perhaps this comes from another tradition, which they're referencing but is not included in the text. Now, this idea that there's things that are coming from another tradition that are being referenced but are not included in the text seems to explain a lot. I don't know how frequently that explanation can be invoked, and I'm not sure even the experts know, because biblical scholarship is a lot of speculation, right? About sources we don't have access to, inferences about the composition of the text we don't have access to. But all throughout the Bible, there are these little nods to things where you're like, okay, there's obviously more of a story going on there than you're giving us. I think the classic example of this is from the beginning of Genesis 6, sons of God and daughters of men. So if you're not familiar, I'll just read that out. When men had begun to be plentiful on the earth, and daughters had been born to them, the sons of God, looking at the daughters of men, saw they were pleasing, so they married as many as they chose. Okay, now that's interesting, isn't it? This idea of the sons of God marrying the daughters of men. That's something interesting is going on there. But what is going on? Who are the sons of God? Different commentaries think maybe these were referring to the angels, although it's not the way we normally refer to the angels, and I think it's not, if you're taking a historical critical view of the Bible, it's not clear that the angels as part of Jewish theology was developed by this point. I think that comes later, like in the books of Isaiah or something like that. But Yahweh said, "My spirit must not forever be disgraced in man, for he is but flesh. His life shall last no more than 120 years." Okay. The Nephilim were on the earth at that time and even afterwards. Okay, so who were the Nephilim? Are the Nephilim the sons of God? Are the Nephilim the offspring of the sons of God and the daughters of men? So it's completely unclear. So I went to Bible Gateway to look at other translations. My first port of call is the NIV because that's what I grew up with. It's equally obscure in the NIV. It's not clear who the Nephilim were. So you go to the Bible commentaries, and yeah, sure enough, the experts are not sure. Apparently, in the original Hebrew, it's not quite clear. Nephilim is used elsewhere in the Bible to refer to giants. So I guess when Caleb and Joshua are reporting about the giants in the land of Canaan, they're using the word Nephilim, but it's not at all clear in this context. I guess there was a race of giants. So the Nephilim were on the earth at that time and even afterwards, when the sons of God resorted to the daughters of men and had children by them. These are the heroes of days gone by, the famous men. So, this just speculating here, and I'm not an expert in anything, but just speculating. This obviously seems like there's a tradition about demigods in the Hebrew mythology that is being referenced here, but it is not being fully fleshed out. And tons of examples of things like this, like talking about Enoch who walked with God, or Nimrod, the mighty conqueror. Nimrod is an interesting one. Where is Nimrod? I think he's was he after the Tower of Babel, or was he before? So Nimrod is referred to as the great. Yeah, Nimrod was after the fall of Babel. Sorry, the Tower of Babel, wasn't he? Actually, I don't. Sorry, I'm gonna have to double check this a second. I remember Nimrod from the. Oh no, maybe Nimrod was okay. Sorry, Nimrod is referred to as the mighty hunter, and I guess he was referred to as a conqueror, possibly the ancestor of the Empire of Babylon, or I don't think that's clear in the text, if I remember. I remember growing up when our Bible school teacher was talking about Nimrod, the mighty hunter, and we were all laughing because we thought Nimrod is an idiot. You go to Wikipedia, apparently, this comes from Looney Tunes. Apparently Bugs Bunny encountered Elmer Fudd in one of the cartoons. He says, "Aw, poor little Nimrod," like an ironic reference to the mighty hunter. And so then I guess ever since in the 20th century, Nimrod has been referred to as a kind of an idiot. That's just one of the many cultural references you can pick up from reading the Bible. I mean, it's one of the reasons that everyone should read the Bible, is just to catch all these cultural references. Point being, I guess, there's a lot of stuff which isn't really, which is difficult to read through without resorting to a lot of commentaries to tell exactly what's going on. I mean, you can read through this to a certain extent. When I read through this, I relied a lot on checking the internet, checking Wikipedia, checking Bible commentaries. It's not absolutely necessary. You could sit in a locked room without any internet and read through the book of Genesis, but there would certainly be a lot of points where you would be confused. Even with the Bible commentaries, there were still a lot of points where I would be confused. It's interesting to note as you're reading through this how little is explained. Again, this is something that Christine Hayes talks about in her lectures series on the Old Testament. Now, she references a book which is called The Art of Biblical Narrative. And I should have written down the author, but I didn't. I'll put that down in the description. Robert Altiff or something like that. I'll look it up later. So I've not read this book. I don't have access to it at the moment, but it was apparently published in the 1980s, apparently very influential in the field of biblical studies. And Christine Hayes references the book when she's talking about the sacrifice of Isaac. And she says, look at this, look at how little is being explained in the sacrifice of Isaac. So it says, Abraham bound Isaac. Is Isaac struggling? Is Isaac fighting back against Abraham as he's binding him, or is Isaac just letting Abraham bind him? Does Isaac know what's happening? Does Isaac say, oh, okay, well, now that you've explained it, that God has demanded me as your sacrifice, I understand. Or is Isaac confused about what's happening? Does Isaac approve of what's happening? Is Isaac crying? And I mean, it's tempting to say, well, the Bible, it's very old. But you can compare this with other old texts, Homer, the Herodotus, which I think are about equally as old as these historical books of the Bible. And there's just way more detail about what is happening and how people are reacting to it in these ancient Greek texts that are written around the same time. So, I guess the point being that this is obviously a narrative choice, which is all throughout the historical books of the Old Testament. Whether it's the J source or the E source or the P source or the D source, they're all they seem to be working from this common narrative style. And having not read the book, I don't know much more about that. I don't know what the hypotheses are about why this particular style is being used. But this particular style is being used all throughout. So you're constantly, as you're reading this, you're constantly like, wait, why? What's going on? I mean, all throughout the Bible. So it'll say, Yahweh was displeased with him and he killed him. Talking about the story with Judah and Tamar in Genesis, where is that? Genesis 38. Judah's firstborn son, why was Yahweh displeased with him? What did he do? It's not in there. The Tower of Babel. It's not, from what's in the text, it's not really clear to me why the men were building this Tower of Babel. It says, let us make a name for ourselves so that we may not be scattered about the whole earth. But it doesn't explicitly say how that's connected with the tower. And definitely for these more famous stories, like the Adam and Eve, the Cain and Abel, the Tower of Babel, the Noah story, quite often, the story that we think we know, we learned it in Sunday school, and the narrative cohesion was added in by our Sunday school teachers or by, the Bible, the picture book Bible for children that we grew up on. When you actually read the Bible, it's a lot more confusing trying to tell what's going on. And at least for me, that confusion and that extra work you had to do trying to figure out what was going on and why it was going on and where are the details here, that had to be factored in to the reading experience. And that's why I think I only read a couple pages at a time. I mean, that in this really small print. But that was something which slowed you down. You read a couple pages and you said, okay, that's enough for today. Gonna go back and go read something that makes a little bit more sense next. It's not always relaxing reading. Although, like a lot of classical literature, if you put in the work for it, the rewards are there plenty. Catching cultural references. Something I mentioned on the weekly reading vlog. Rereading Genesis 38, the story of Judah and Tamar, which I had been exposed to back in my Bible school, but I don't believe I read since then. Realizing that Judah's second son, Onan, is where we get the word onanism from, which is, I think, a 19th century term for masturbation. And just having that click moment is throughout a lot of the Bible, certainly through a lot of the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis contains a lot of stories that anybody who grows up in the West is very familiar with, whether they go to Sunday school or not. Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Noah's Ark, Tower of Babel, Joseph and the coat of many colors. Although it's interesting, reading these, you realize that you're actually maybe not as familiar with them as you thought, because number one, like I said, the actual text of the Bible is much more ambiguous than the Sunday school stories we grew up with. And two, there's a lot of interesting things which actually are not in the Bible. Some of these date back, I think, to translation issues with the King James Version. But, Adam and Eve did not eat an apple. It was just some sort of fruit. I think that's a translation issue. I was surprised to discover, or rediscover, I'm not sure if I knew this at one point, but if I knew it, I forgot, that Joseph actually, it does not say a coat of many colors. Again, it says an ornate coat, or a long coat with long sleeves. Again, I looked this up on Wikipedia. This comes from the King James translation. But apparently the original Hebrew does not say a coat of many colors. It says a coat with long sleeves. I think that talking about maybe the history related in the book of Genesis, I believe the consensus is that this is not of any historical value. Sorry, that's putting it a little bit harsh. It's not historical, plainly speaking. Robin Lane Fox, in his book, Truth and Fiction in the Bible, the unauthorized version, talks about Genesis 14, which is the campaign of 4 great kings. So this is 4 kings in Mesopotamia who are rebelling against 5 kings in Mesopotamia. And in the course of this little war, Lot and his family, who are living in Sodom, get caught up in the war, and then Abraham has to go and rescue them. Seems to sound historical because it's matching kings with different cities and stuff like that. In his book, Robin Lane Fox talked about the effort that's been done over the years to connect this with archaeology or other historical documents, but nothing has come up. As well as, this will be more of a factor later in the historical narrative, but the conquest of Canaan does not match up with the archaeological evidence. The conquest of Canaan, as it's described in the Bible, does not match up with the archaeological evidence, which I think puts into doubt the whole historical narrative before the conquest of Canaan. But it is interesting historically because the writers are obviously trying to work backwards from the state of the world that they know it and create origin stories for what they know. So, for example, the story of Jacob and Esau, over and over again, it's emphasizing that Esau is the ancestor of the Edomites, and Edomites, and Jacob is the ancestor of the Israelites. And so it's setting this historical antagonism back. And then there's a lot of weird stuff about Jacob and his sons, which apparently is meant up to set up the 12 tribes of Israel. For example, there's this interesting little passage where Reuben sleeps with his father's concubine, Bilhah, Bilzah, and his father finds out about it. And you're reading it, and you're thinking, well, that's weird. What's the point of that? Because, typical biblical narration style doesn't really describe anything else. It says, Reuben slept with his father's concubine, and his father learned about it. It comes back around again in chapter 49. This is where Jacob is giving the blessings to all his sons. And he says, okay, Reuben, even though you're my firstborn son, you are not going to get my firstborn blessing because you slept with my concubine. So again, going to Wikipedia, looking up the tribe of Reuben, going to the Bible commentaries, nobody knows for sure. There's a lot of speculation. but it's looking like sometime during the historical period, the tribe of Reuben may have lost their homeland. This is something we infer from, I think, some Moabite documents which describe fighting the tribe of Gad, but seem to ignore where the tribe of Reuben would have been, or other pieces of the puzzle people are putting together. So it's looking like perhaps once the tribe of Reuben had gotten kicked off of their land, then this was something that got put into the origin story of the 12 tribes of Israel. The other thing, I mean, there's a lot of interesting things like that in here. There's a story where their sister, they only have one sister, Dinah. She gets raped by the Shechemites. The Shechemites work out a deal with Jacob to marry her, but then Simeon and Levi renege on the deal and go and kill all the Shechemites, and Jacob is really angry about that. So then we come back to, and again, when you're reading it, you're like, okay, well, this is another strange story. Why is this in here? You know, what's the point of this story? But then you get to Jacob's blessing, and Jacob brings this up again. And he says, you know, because you did this to me, and you killed the Shechemites after I had worked out my deal with them, he says, I will scatter you among Israel. And you look at the footnotes, and I guess both the tribe of Levi and the tribe of Simeon were scattered. Now this again is something where I had to go to the Wikipedia and the commentary and stuff like that. But I guess the tribe of Simeon, if you look at a map of the 12 tribes, it was enclosed within the territory of Judah. So, you know, here's Judah coming around. Here is Simeon in the middle of it. And then over time, we don't get references to Simeon. So, or there's something in Chronicles about how Simeon spread out into 2 colonies and 1 colony was outside the Promised Land. But other than that, it appears that there's also another passage about how the tribe of Judah had much more offspring than the tribe of Simeon. But when you put all the pieces together, it looks like the tribe of Simeon just ceased to exist and got absorbed by the tribe of Judah. The tribe of Levi was never given a land allotment, according to the historical narrative. God set them aside to be his special priests. So they would have like sanctuary cities among the tribes of Israel, but they did not have their own territory. Now, having mentioned that, if you look at these biblical commentaries, they will say, okay, you know, what's a little bit odd about this explanation, though, is it looks like the tribe of Levi is being given the priestly duties as a reward. So it doesn't look like it's a punishment. But then that's later in the narrative. I forget when Levi becomes set aside, Exodus or Leviticus, where Levi becomes the priest. But it does say here that Levi and Simeon are both going to be scattered among the tribes of Israel because of the way they betrayed their father. So, I mean, I know I'm rambling, and there is a ton of stuff in here I haven't even started to talk about. But that's the point. The point is that there's a ton of interesting stuff in here, and you would I think to get the full benefit out of it, you would need a good commentary, or you would need, like I did, to spend a lot of time researching this online or going to Wikipedia. But there's a lot of very interesting detail in here, even though the reading experience can be disjointed because there's so many things that either don't appear to make sense or appear disconnected or stuff like that. Oh, I almost forgot another thing. So the 12 tribes of Israel are actually 13 tribes. This is something that always used to confuse me as a kid, because there are 12 sons of Jacob. And then Joseph's 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, also get an inheritance. And I guess the way that this is described, is that the tribe of Levi doesn't get a land inheritance. So there are 12 tribes that get a land inheritance, even though the tribe of Simeon is later swallowed up by the tribe of Judah. And when Jacob is blessing Ephraim and Manasseh, they get put before Jacob, but Jacob switches his hands, crosses his hands over, so that Ephraim, the youngest son, gets his right hand, and Manasseh, his oldest son, gets his left hand. And Joseph says, no, you've got it backwards. Manasseh is the oldest. And Jacob says, what does Jacob say? Something like, he says, don't worry, I'm going to bless them both. Manasseh is going to be a great people as well. But Ephraim is going to be the greater one. Okay, so again, you go back to Wikipedia. If you look at Wikipedia, on the map, the tribe of Manasseh is huge. In fact, the tribe of Manasseh is, I guess, the only tribe that has territories on both sides of the Jordan. And some people think that the tribe of Manasseh was actually two different half-tribes. I think this is based on something in Chronicles, because they were split by the Jordan River. But Ephraim was where the capital of the northern kingdom was. And I believe, if my Sunday school days are correct, quite often it refers to the land of Israel as the land of Ephraim, because that's where the power center was. So there's this, and Ephraim and Manasseh and Benjamin, apparently scholars think that one time these were all part of the tribes of Joseph. And then a little bit later, there was split, where Ephraim and Manasseh were from the tribe of Joseph, and Benjamin was given a different origin story. But that would explain why Benjamin and Joseph were both the sons of Rachel, and why they're both contiguous on their territories are next to each other on the map. This will all make more sense if you consult a map while you're looking at the 12 tribes of Israel. Wikipedia has one, which I've been using. Okay, I'm going to have to stop it here. I can't talk about this forever. I have barely scratched the surface about all the things there are to talk about in here. But, it's the Bible. You could talk about it forever, huh? So on next to the book of Exodus, and whenever I finish that, I will give that a similar long, rambling review.